Some nights don't give you the luxury of right or wrong, only the burden of choice. Ethan had learned that the hard way ever since he became a single father, carrying the weight of two lives on a paycheck that barely covered one. His son was asleep at home, fragile lungs rising and falling unevenly, a bottle of medication on the kitchen counter that cost more than Ethan's entire shift that night. Rain hammered against the windshield as he drove through empty streets, calculating minutes, dollars, and risks the way other people counted sheep. If he made it home on time, his son would get his medicine before midnight. If he didn't, the consequences could be catastrophic. That was when he saw the figure on the side of the road, a body slumped near a flickering streetlight, unmoving, rain pooling around worn shoes and trembling hands. Ethan's foot hovered over the brake, his chest tightening as instinct collided with fear. Stopping meant delay, and delay meant gambling with his child's life. Every logical thought screamed at him to keep driving, to call someone else, to let the world handle its own emergencies for once. After all, the world had never stopped for him. But some lessons don't come from logic. They come from long hospital nights, whispered promises, and the quiet knowledge that your child is watching who you choose to be. Ethan pulled over, rain soaking through his jacket as he stepped into a decision he couldn't undo. He had no idea that this moment, meant only to save a stranger, would soon test everything he believed about sacrifice, guilt, and the true cost of kindness. Ethan had learned to measure his life in small victories: a full night without coughing, a prescription filled on time, a smile that didn't fade too quickly. Before Liam got sick, Ethan used to think life was divided into big moments: promotions, anniversaries, turning points people talked about years later. But now, everything that mattered came quietly, almost invisibly, tucked between exhaustion and routine. Survival didn't announce itself. It whispered. The apartment was quiet when Ethan returned home that night, the rain still echoing faintly in his ears, even after the door shut behind him. He stood for a moment in the narrow entryway, listening. No coughing, no panicked gasps, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the cheap wall clock above the sink. He exhaled, long and slow. Liam's bedroom door was half open. Ethan peeked inside, careful not to wake him. His son lay curled on his side, clutching the edge of his blanket, chest rising unevenly, but steadily enough. The nebulizer sat on the nightstand, its tubing coiled neatly the way Ethan always left it, as if order alone could keep the chaos at bay. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, letting the fatigue finally reach him. His legs ached. His hands were still cold from the rain. Somewhere deep in his chest, guilt stirred. Not sharp, not loud, but persistent. He hadn't been home when he promised he would be. The medication sat untouched on the kitchen counter. He crossed the apartment and picked it up, turning the bottle in his hands. The label felt heavier than plastic should. Everything in his life felt heavier lately, as if gravity itself had quietly increased without warning. "I'm here now," he whispered, though no one was listening. Ethan hadn't always been alone in this. There was a time when the apartment had felt smaller for a different reason. Toys scattered across the floor, laughter echoing down the hallway, a woman's shoes by the door. His wife, Claire, had filled space effortlessly. She talked with her hands, laughed too loudly at her own jokes, and believed with unshakable confidence that things would work out. She had been the one to notice something was wrong with Liam first. "He breathes funny when he sleeps," she'd said one night, brow furrowed as she leaned over the crib. Ethan had brushed it off. Babies made strange sounds. He'd Googled enough at 3 a.m. to convince himself everything was normal. He was wrong. By the time they reached the hospital weeks later, the diagnosis came quickly, efficiently, delivered in calm tones that didn't match the way Ethan's world tilted sideways. Chronic. Manageable, they said. But manageable came with conditions, costs, and an unspoken understanding that life would never again be simple. Claire tried to stay strong. She learned medical terms faster than Ethan did, organized binders of test results, asked doctors sharp questions he hadn't thought to ask. But illness didn't just drain bodies, it drained marriages. The nights grew longer, the bills stacked higher, conversations turned transactional, clipped, always circling back to appointments and money and fear. Love didn't disappear. It thinned, stretched until it became fragile. When Claire died, it wasn't from illness. It was a car accident on her way home from a late shift, one rainy evening not unlike this one. Ethan still remembered the phone call, the way the officer's voice softened when he asked if Ethan was sitting down, the sound Liam made when he cried, confused and frightened, reaching for a mother who wouldn't come back. From that day on, Ethan learned what real loneliness felt like. Not the absence of people, but the absence of relief. There was no one to tap in when he collapsed, no one to share the weight, just him, always him. The rain-soaked stranger stayed with him in the days that followed, not constantly, not obsessively, but in quiet moments, folding laundry, waiting in line at the pharmacy, staring at the ceiling while sleep refused to come. The image surfaced uninvited, the flickering streetlight, the man's pale face, the choice. Ethan replayed the moment over and over, as if there were alternate versions of reality hidden somewhere inside it. In one, he drove past. He got home on time. The medicine was administered exactly when it should have been. Nothing went wrong. In another, he stopped, and everything that followed unfolded exactly as it had. He didn't know which version was better. What he did know was that even now, weeks later, he didn't regret stopping. The guilt he felt wasn't regret. It was fear. Fear of how fragile everything was, how easily one decision could tip the balance. Fear that he was constantly choosing between the world and his son, and that someday he would choose wrong. The call from the hospital came 3 days later. Ethan was in the middle of a delivery, balancing a cardboard box on his hip, when his phone vibrated in his pocket. He almost ignored it. Unknown number, probably spam. But something, instinct maybe, made him stop. "Yes?" he answered, heart already accelerating. "Mr. Carter?" the voice asked. "This is St. Mary's Children's Hospital. We need you to come in." No explanation, no reassurance. Ethan dropped the box without a word, muttered an apology to no one in particular, and was back in his car within seconds. The drive blurred into a streak of red lights and clenched teeth. Every possible outcome raced through his mind. None of them good. At the hospital, the doctor didn't waste time. Liam's condition had escalated. The current treatment plan was no longer sufficient. They needed to consider advanced options. Therapies with higher success rates, but also higher costs and stricter eligibility requirements. "There's a waiting list," the doctor said carefully, "and funding limitations." Ethan nodded, gripping the edge of the chair. "Is he in danger?" he asked. The doctor paused just long enough. "Yes," she said. "Eventually." Eventually. Another word that felt like a threat. The next 2 weeks passed in a state of suspended panic. Ethan called insurance providers until his voice went hoarse. He filled out forms he barely understood. He left messages that went unanswered. Every conversation ended the same way. Sympathetic tone, regretful pause, polite refusal. "We're very sorry, Mr. Carter." Sorry didn't help his son breathe. Liam sensed the shift even when Ethan tried to hide it. Children always did. One night, as Ethan tucked him into bed, Liam grabbed his sleeve with surprising strength. "Daddy," he said quietly, "if I get worse, will you still be here?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not ever." "But you look scared," Liam whispered. Ethan forced a smile. "Everyone gets scared sometimes." Liam studied him for a long moment, then nodded solemnly. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "But when I'm scared, I think about you fixing things." Ethan laughed softly. "Fixing things?" "You fix stuff," Liam said matter-of-factly, "even when it's broken." The words hit Ethan harder than any diagnosis. 3 weeks after the night in the rain, Ethan received another call. This one was different. A hospital administrator asked him to come in. No urgency in her voice, no warning either. Ethan braced himself anyway. He had learned that hope was dangerous. They met in a small conference room, walls bare except for a framed poster about patient advocacy. A social worker joined them, followed by a woman Ethan didn't recognize. "There's been a development," the administrator said. She explained that a treatment slot had become available, unexpectedly, unusually. A private foundation had stepped in to fund a limited number of cases that fell outside standard approval processes. Liam qualified. Ethan stared at her, certain he'd misunderstood. "Why?" he asked. "We weren't approved." The woman from the foundation finally spoke. "Because someone insisted we look closer," she said gently. Ethan's heart pounded. "Who?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Someone who remembers a night in the rain." Ethan didn't trust the feeling that rose in his chest after the meeting. It wasn't joy, it wasn't relief, it was caution. He had lived too long in a world where good news came with conditions, where hope was often followed by disappointment sharp enough to leave scars. So when the administrator finished explaining the funding, the treatment schedule, the logistics that suddenly seemed to align too perfectly, Ethan sat there in silence, hands folded so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Are you sure?" he asked finally. "There hasn't been a mistake?" The woman from the foundation shook her head. "We double-checked everything." Ethan nodded, but the tension didn't leave his shoulders. People didn't just step in like this. Not for families like his. Not without a reason. That night, after Liam fell asleep, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table, the dim overhead light casting long shadows across unpaid bills and folded paperwork. The rain had stopped hours earlier, but he could still hear it in his mind, tapping against windows that no longer existed. Someone remembered a night in the rain. The words echoed, refusing to settle. The foundation representative, whose name was Sarah, explained the process carefully over the next few days. There would be evaluations, approvals, monitoring. Nothing about it was rushed or reckless. If anything, it was methodical to the point of exhaustion. But every form they asked Ethan to sign felt surreal, like paperwork from a life that didn't belong to him. Liam would be enrolled in a pilot treatment program. It wasn't experimental in the dangerous sense, but it was limited, expensive, and reserved for cases that required special consideration. "What does that mean?" Ethan asked. Sarah hesitated. "It means someone fought for your son to be seen as more than a file number." Ethan swallowed. He wanted to ask who. He didn't. Some part of him understood that knowing might break something fragile. While Ethan navigated appointments and schedules somewhere else in the city, Daniel struggled with a different kind of reckoning. He had woken up in the hospital 3 weeks earlier with no memory of how he'd gotten there. The last thing he remembered clearly was the rain, the cold seeping into his bones, the way the world had narrowed to the rhythm of his own shallow breaths. Then there had been a voice, low, calm, unfamiliar. "Stay with me." The doctors later explained that he'd collapsed from hypoglycemia, compounded by exhaustion and untreated injuries from a fall earlier that day. They said if he hadn't been found when he was, the outcome would have been very different. Daniel didn't need them to tell him that. He could feel it in his body, the thin line he had walked between before and after. When he was discharged, a nurse handed him his belongings, wallet, phone, keys. His jacket was missing. "Someone used it for first aid," she explained. Daniel nodded, throat tight. Daniel worked for a foundation that funded medical care for underserved families. It wasn't glamorous work. Most days were spreadsheets, committee meetings, budget constraints, and letters that began with, "We regret to inform you." He believed in the mission, but over time the sheer volume of need had worn him down. You learned to distance yourself, or you burned out. After the hospital, distance felt impossible. He kept thinking about the man who had stopped, not just that he had stopped, um, but how he had stayed, how he had spoken, how his hands had shaken slightly as he worked, betraying fear without surrendering to it. Daniel remembered the voice more clearly than the face. It sounded like someone who knew loss intimately. Back at work, Daniel returned to his routine, but something had shifted. When applications crossed his desk now, he read them differently. He imagined rain. He imagined hesitation. He imagined someone choosing to stop when it would have been easier not to. One case in particular caught his attention. Single father, 8-year-old son, chronic respiratory condition, denied advanced treatment due to funding limitations. Daniel froze. The details were familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. Not because he recognized the name, he didn't, but because he recognized the weight behind the words. He saw himself collapsed under a streetlight. He saw steady hands pressing fabric against a wound. He read the application twice, then a third time. And then he did something he hadn't done in years. He picked up the phone. Ethan noticed changes in Liam before the doctors did. It wasn't dramatic. There were no overnight transformations, no sudden bursts of energy. But the pauses between breaths shortened. The nights grew quieter. The panic that had lived just under the surface of every moment loosened its grip. One morning, Liam woke up and asked for pancakes. Ethan stood in the kitchen, spatula in hand, blinking back tears. "Chocolate chips?" he asked. Liam grinned. "Extra." Small victories. That afternoon, Ethan received an email confirming the next phase of treatment. Attached was a note from the foundation, brief and professional. "We're rooting for you." Ethan stared at the screen longer than necessary. Despite the progress, doubt lingered. Late at night, Ethan replayed the night in the rain again, but now the memory carried a new weight. Not fear this time, or a responsibility. If his decision had set something in motion, did that mean every choice carried unseen consequences? Did that mean there were people he hadn't helped, paths he hadn't taken, outcomes he'd unknowingly shaped? The thought was unsettling. He had always believed he was small in the grand scheme of things. A single father scraping by, invisible to systems designed for people with more resources, more margin for error. The idea that his actions could ripple outward contradicted everything he thought he knew about his place in the world. It made him uneasy. Daniel requested a review meeting. The committee members were skeptical at first. They always were. "Resources are limited," one of them said, fingers steepled. "If we make exceptions here—" "We already do," Daniel interrupted quietly. "We just don't like to admit it." Silence followed. Daniel didn't mention the rain. He didn't mention the jacket, or the voice, or the way someone had chosen him without knowing who he was. He spoke instead about data, long-term outcomes, potential cost reductions through early intervention. But beneath every word was something unspoken. This child mattered because someone mattered enough to stop. The committee approved the funding. Daniel sat alone afterward, staring at the confirmation email. His hands trembled, and he let them. This wasn't about bending rules. It was about remembering why the rules existed in the first place. Ethan never learned about the meeting. He never knew how close the decision had come to going the other way. All he knew was that, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't defined solely by survival. He imagined Liam growing taller, imagined school plays instead of hospital rooms, imagined a life where fear didn't dictate every decision. Hope was still dangerous, but it was no longer impossible. One afternoon, while waiting for Liam's follow-up appointment, Ethan struck up a conversation with a nurse. She mentioned a man who worked with the foundation, someone who visited occasionally to check on cases. "He's very hands-on," she said. "Not common in that line of work." Ethan nodded politely, not thinking much of it. But later, sitting alone in the waiting room, the thought returned. Someone remembered the rain. Daniel watched updates on Liam's case from a distance. He resisted the urge to reach out, to insert himself into the story more directly. He knew better. This wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about closure. It was about balance. Still, he wondered. He wondered if the man who had helped him ever questioned his choice, if he ever lay awake at night calculating costs and consequences, if he ever regretted stopping. Daniel hoped someday he could tell him what that moment had meant, not as a transaction, but as proof. Ethan's life didn't become easier overnight. Work was still unpredictable. Money was still tight. Fear still surfaced when Liam coughed too long or slept too deeply. But something had shifted beneath it all, a quiet certainty that even when the world felt indifferent, individual moments still mattered. That choosing to act, even when afraid, wasn't pointless. That kindness didn't always announce its return. Sometimes it worked silently, through channels you never saw, carried by people you might never meet. And somewhere, without knowing it, two lives continued to orbit the same moment in the rain, connected not by names or gratitude, but by a choice neither of them could take back. The night Liam crashed, Ethan knew something was wrong before the machine said anything. It wasn't the sound of coughing this time. That he had learned to recognize. This was quieter. Too quiet. Liam lay unnaturally still, eyes half open, chest rising in shallow, uneven bursts that felt disconnected from effort. His skin was clammy beneath Ethan's fingers, cool in a way that made panic ignite instantly. "Liam?" Ethan whispered, shaking him gently. "Hey, buddy, look at me." Nothing. Ethan didn't remember grabbing his keys or dialing emergency services. His body moved ahead of his thoughts, operating on a level that bypassed fear entirely. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was already kneeling on the floor, counting breaths out loud, voice breaking only when he thought no one could hear. At the hospital, everything accelerated. Hallways blurred, words overlapped. Someone took Liam from his arms, and for one unbearable moment, Ethan hesitated before letting go, terrified that if he released him, he might not get him back. The doors to the treatment area closed. Ethan stood alone. Hours passed in fragments. A nurse brought him water he didn't drink. A doctor spoke to him in careful tones, explaining complications, risk factors, margins that were thinner than anyone liked. Ethan nodded, asked the right questions, signed forms with shaking hands. The treatment had helped, but Liam's condition was unpredictable. Improvement didn't mean stability. Stability didn't mean safety. "We're doing everything we can," the doctor said, "but we need to be honest with you." Honesty was a double-edged thing. Ethan wanted it. He needed it. But every truth felt like another weight added to a structure already close to collapse. That night, Ethan slept in a chair beside Liam's bed, waking at every change in rhythm, every flicker of the monitors. He dreamed of rain and streetlights and a man lying motionless while the world debated whether stopping was worth the cost. 2 floors above them, Daniel stood at a window, staring out at the city. He hadn't planned to be there. He told himself that repeatedly. His visit was procedural, professional, a routine check-in on cases the foundation supported. But when he saw the name on the patient board, something in his chest tightened. He didn't go to the room. He didn't ask to meet the family. Instead, he spoke quietly with staff, asked careful questions, listened, and what he heard unsettled him. The treatment was working, but barely. Liam's condition was more severe than initially documented. There were additional complications, genetic factors that limited options further. If things deteriorated, the next step would be aggressive, risky, and resource-intensive. "There's no guarantee," one doctor said, "and the cost is significant." Daniel thanked them and stepped back into the hallway, heart pounding. He had pushed for this case. He had argued numbers, outcomes, probabilities. He believed in the decision. But belief felt different when a child's life was no longer abstract. Ethan noticed the man standing in the hallway before he knew why. Something about the posture, the stillness, the way he seemed present without intruding. They didn't speak at first. Ethan didn't know who Daniel was, and Daniel didn't know how to begin. They shared the silence of people orbiting the same fear from different angles. Eventually, Daniel cleared his throat. "You're Liam's father," he said. Ethan nodded, cautious. "Yes. I work with the foundation," Daniel continued. "I wanted to check in." Ethan studied him, searching for something, reassurance, authority, threat. He found none of it. Just concern, genuine, unguarded concern. "Is he going to be okay?" Ethan asked. Daniel hesitated. "I hope so," he said honestly. Hope, again, dangerous and fragile. The crisis came just before dawn. Liam's oxygen levels dropped suddenly, alarms piercing the quiet like shattered glass. Nurses moved fast, voices urgent but controlled. Ethan was ushered back, pressed against a wall, forced to watch as professionals did what he couldn't. His heart hammered violently against his ribs, each second stretching unbearably long. "Please," he whispered, not to anyone in particular. "Please." Time fractured again. Later, minutes or hours, Ethan couldn't tell. The doctor emerged, exhaustion etched into her face. "He's stable," she said, "for now." Ethan sagged against the wall, legs barely holding him upright. "But," she added gently, "we need to talk." They sat in a small consultation room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and burnt coffee. The doctor laid out the reality with brutal clarity. Liam needed a more aggressive intervention. The window was narrow, the risks were significant. Without it, the pattern would repeat: crashes, recoveries, diminishing returns. With it? Ethan asked. "There's a chance," she said. "Not certainty, but a chance." "And the cost?" Ethan asked quietly, already knowing. The doctor didn't answer immediately. Daniel sat in on the meeting at the doctor's request. Ethan noticed him then, really noticed him, the faint scar on his forehead, the familiar calm in his voice. Something tugged at the edge of recognition, but exhaustion dulled it. "The foundation can help," Daniel said carefully, "but this goes beyond what was initially approved." "How far beyond?" Ethan asked. Daniel met his gaze. "Far enough that it will require another review, another waiting room, another stretch of time where everything could go wrong." Ethan's hands curled into fists. I don't have time, he said. My son doesn't have time. I know, Daniel replied. That's why I'm here. That night, Ethan sat beside Liam, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to the machines that had become the background music of his life. I don't know how to fix this, he whispered. I'm trying so hard. Liam stirred, eyes fluttering open. You always fix things, he murmured. Ethan smiled weakly. Not everything. Liam frowned, thinking. Then we fix it together. The simplicity of the statement broke something open inside Ethan. Tears slid down his face unchecked. Yeah, he said softly. Together. Daniel spent the night pacing hospital corridors. He had crossed lines already. Emotionally, ethically. Not rules exactly, but distance. He had allowed a personal experience to shape professional judgment. He knew the arguments against it. He had made them himself for years. But standing there, hearing the soft beeping of machines through closed doors, he couldn't pretend this was just another case. He thought about the night in the rain. He thought about how easily he could have died, how a stranger's decision had rewritten his future, and he wondered what responsibility came with surviving. The review committee met the next morning. Daniel presented the case again, this time with updated data, medical urgency clearly outlined. But beneath the charts and projections, there was something else in his voice, a quiet insistence that refused to be dismissed. We talk a lot about impact, he said, about using resources where they matter most. This is where they matter. Some members pushed back, others listened. Finally, a woman at the end of the table spoke. Why this case? She asked. Daniel paused. Because sometimes, he said slowly, we don't just fund outcomes, we fund people. And this child has someone who will fight for him no matter what. That matters. Silence followed. Then one by one, heads nodded. Ethan learned about the decision in the least dramatic way possible. A nurse smiled as she adjusted a monitor. Looks like you're staying with us a bit longer, she said. We're moving forward. Ethan blinked. We are? She nodded. Everything's approved. The words felt unreal. Approved. He sat down heavily, head in his hands, emotion crashing through him in waves. Relief, fear, gratitude so sharp it hurt. Daniel stood in the doorway watching quietly. This time, when their eyes met, recognition sparked. You, Ethan said hoarsely. Daniel nodded. The rain, he said. Everything aligned in that moment. Memory, understanding, consequence. Ethan stood slowly. You were the man on the street. And you, Daniel replied, voice thick, were the one who stopped. They didn't say thank you. They didn't need to. The moment held something deeper, an acknowledgement that neither of them had chosen this path for reward. That kindness had moved through them, not from one to the other, but outward, branching in ways neither could control. As the doctors prepared for the procedure that would decide Liam's future, Ethan stood by his son's bed, holding his hand with quiet resolve. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing with certainty. Stopping that night had not been a mistake. The surgery took 6 hours. 6 hours of waiting that stretched longer than any night Ethan had ever endured. He paced the hallway until his legs burned, then sat, then stood again, unable to let his body rest when his mind refused to do the same. The hospital corridor smelled faintly of disinfectant and something warm from the cafeteria below, a strange reminder that life continued in ordinary ways even when his felt suspended. Daniel waited nearby, never intruding, never leaving. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. Words felt inadequate in a place where everything important depended on skill, timing, and a fragile margin of error. When the surgeon finally appeared, removing her mask with slow, deliberate movements, Ethan's heart nearly stopped. It went as well as we could have hoped, she said. Ethan didn't realize he was holding his breath until it rushed out of him in a broken sound that was half sob, half laugh. He gripped the edge of the wall to steady himself, overwhelmed by relief so intense it felt like pain. There will be recovery, she continued, monitoring adjustments. But the worst is behind us. Behind us. For the first time in years, those words didn't feel like a lie. Liam slept for 2 days straight after the surgery. Ethan barely left his side. He learned the new rhythms of recovery the same way he had learned everything else, by watching, listening, memorizing. The machines still hummed and beeped, but their sounds no longer felt like threats. They were tools, Now. Helpers. When Liam finally woke, his voice was hoarse and faint. "Did I miss breakfast?" he asked. Ethan laughed, pressing his forehead gently against Liam's hand. "You missed about 6 of them." Liam frowned. "That seems inefficient." Ethan laughed harder, tears sliding down his face unchecked. He didn't bother wiping them away. Recovery was not a straight line. There were setbacks, small infections, unexpected reactions, days when progress seemed to stall. But there was also movement forward, tangible, measurable improvement. Liam's breathing grew stronger. His color returned. The fear that had once defined every moment loosened its grip little by little. Ethan found himself sleeping again. Not deeply, not without interruption, but enough that the fog in his mind began to clear. He noticed things he hadn't in years. The way morning light filtered through hospital blinds. The quiet kindness of nurses who remembered Liam's favorite juice. The simple miracle of watching his son laugh without coughing. Life was still hard, but it was no longer only hard. Daniel visited occasionally, always with purpose, never lingering longer than necessary. He brought updates from the foundation, logistical support, information about long-term care options. But beneath the professionalism, something else grew. A quiet respect that didn't require explanation. One afternoon, as Liam slept, Ethan finally spoke the question that had been forming for weeks. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. Daniel looked at him carefully. "Neither did you." Ethan shook his head. "Stopping that night, that was instinct. What you did was a choice." Daniel considered that. "Instinct is a form of choice," he said finally. "It just happens faster." They sat in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that no longer felt awkward. When Liam was discharged, the apartment felt different. The same furniture, the same narrow kitchen, but something fundamental had shifted. The space no longer felt like a bunker built for survival. It felt cautiously, tentatively, like a home again. Ethan reorganized the medicine cabinet, setting aside bottles that were no longer needed. He took down old appointment reminders from the fridge, replacing them with a single calendar marked with follow-up visits months apart instead of days. Liam noticed immediately. "We don't need this one anymore," he said, pointing to an old emergency plan taped to the wall. Ethan hesitated, then peeled it down carefully. "No," he said softly, "we don't." The foundation continued to support them, not indefinitely, but long enough to ensure stability. Ethan returned to work gradually, choosing fewer hours, learning, awkwardly, how to exist without constant crisis. It was harder than he expected. When survival had been his only focus, there had been no room for reflection. Now, in the quiet spaces between tasks, memories crept in. The rain, the streetlight, the moment his foot hovered over the brake. He realized something unsettling. If he hadn't stopped that night, Liam might still be alive. But if he hadn't stopped, Liam might not have survived the surgery either. Both truths existed simultaneously. Reconciling them took time. Ethan began to change in small ways. He started talking to other parents at the hospital during follow-up visits, sharing information without being asked. He volunteered occasionally, fixing broken chairs, tightening loose screws, offering practical help, because that was what he knew how to do. One mother thanked him through tears after he showed her how to clean a nebulizer properly. "I don't know how you know all this," she said. Ethan smiled gently. "You learn when you have to." He didn't think of himself as generous or brave. He still felt afraid more often than not. But he had learned that fear didn't disqualify action. If anything, it made action more meaningful. Daniel, too, changed. He returned to work with a sharper sense of purpose and a heavier awareness of responsibility. He advocated more fiercely, asked harder questions, pushed back against convenient denials. Not every case ended like Liam's, he knew that, but he no longer allowed distance to numb him completely. He had learned the hard way that empathy was not a weakness to be managed, but a compass to be trusted. Sometimes, late at night, Daniel thought about the version of himself who had collapsed alone in the rain, the man who might not have survived. That version felt like a stranger now. One decision had separated them. Months passed. Liam returned to school part-time, then full-time. He grew taller, stronger. He ran slower than other kids, but he ran. Ethan watched him from the sidelines, heart full in a way that still felt unfamiliar. "You're staring," Liam said one afternoon, catching him, watching from the park bench. "I'm admiring," Ethan replied. Liam grinned. That's fair. One evening, as they walked home under clear skies, Liam looked up at Ethan. Daddy, he said, do you think bad things happen for a reason? Ethan considered the question carefully. I think bad things happen, he said. The reason comes after. Sometimes we make it, sometimes we don't. Liam nodded, thinking. I think you made one. Ethan smiled, squeezing his hand. Maybe. The rain came again months later, softer this time. Ethan stood by the window watching it fall. No longer flinching at the sound, he thought about how close he had come to losing everything, how close he had come to choosing differently. He understood now that kindness was not a guarantee. It didn't erase consequences or shield you from pain. It didn't make life fair, but it connected people. It moved quietly through systems and strangers and moments no one would ever see. It traveled farther than fear ever could. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it found its way back. Life did not announce its return to normal. There was no clear line where fear ended and peace began, no ceremony to mark the moment Ethan stopped waking up in a panic. Normal came gradually, almost imperceptibly, woven into routine. A morning without checking a monitor, an afternoon where laughter wasn't followed by coughing, a night where sleep came without bargaining. Ethan learned that recovery was not just physical. It was a retraining of the mind. For years, every decision had been filtered through urgency. What if he stops breathing? What if the medicine runs out? What if today is the day everything collapses? That way of thinking didn't disappear just because the danger receded. It lingered, embedded in reflexes and habits. Letting go required effort. One afternoon, months after Liam's surgery, Ethan found the jacket he had worn the night it rained. It was stuffed into the back of the closet, still faintly stained despite multiple washes. He held it for a long moment, fingers tracing the worn fabric, remembering how heavy it had felt soaked through, how insignificant it had seemed compared to the weight of the decision it carried. Liam watched him from the doorway. You don't wear that one anymore, he said. Ethan smiled. It's retired. Because it's old? Because it did its job, Ethan replied. Liam nodded solemnly, as if that explanation made perfect sense. Daniel drifted out of their daily lives as he had always intended to, not because the connection meant less now, but because it meant enough. Their relationship didn't need constant tending. It existed in a shared understanding that required no maintenance. Once, during a routine follow-up, Daniel and Ethan crossed paths in the hallway. They exchanged a quiet greeting, nothing more. Afterward, Ethan realized something important. He didn't need to see Daniel to remember the rain. Ethan often thought about how differently the story could have ended. He had learned that imagining alternate outcomes was a dangerous habit, but he indulged it occasionally, carefully, like touching something hot just to confirm it still burned. He imagined driving past the streetlight, imagined getting home on time, imagined never meeting Daniel at all. That version of the world felt smaller, not darker, just narrower, as if something essential had been removed without anyone noticing. He realized then that the most powerful changes weren't the dramatic ones. They were the subtle expansions of perspective, the moments that quietly altered how you understood your place in the world. Liam, now stronger, began asking questions again. Not the frightened ones from hospital nights, but curious ones. Why do people help strangers? He asked one evening as they washed dishes together. Ethan considered the question carefully, drying his hands on a towel worn thin with age. Sometimes, he said, because they hope someone would do the same for them. Liam thought about that. Did you hope someone would help you? Ethan smiled softly. I don't think I was hoping for anything that night. Then why did you stop? Ethan paused. Because I knew what it felt like to be scared and alone, he said, and I didn't want him to feel that way if I could change it. Liam nodded, satisfied. Ethan understood now that kindness wasn't a transaction. That was the mistake people often made, believing good deeds were deposits waiting for withdrawal. They weren't. Kindness was movement. It flowed outward, changed shape, passed through people and systems and moments beyond your control. Sometimes it came back to you, sometimes it didn't. The return was never the point. What mattered was that it moved. There were still hard days. Bills didn't disappear. Work remained uncertain. Some nights Ethan still lay awake listening to Liam breathe, old habits slow to fade. But the fear no longer owned him. It had become something he carried, not something that carried him. He had learned that Being afraid and being brave were not opposites. They were companions. On the anniversary of the surgery, Ethan and Liam walked past the street where everything had begun. The streetlight had been repaired since then, no longer flickering, its glow steady and unremarkable. Is this where it happened? Liam asked. Yes, Ethan said. Liam looked around disappointed. It looks normal. Ethan smiled. Most important places do. They stood there for a moment, cars passing by, rain absent, the world indifferent, and yet everything was different. Ethan thought about how many moments like that existed, unnoticed intersections of choice and consequence, invisible to everyone except the people who carried them. He wondered how many times others had stopped for him in ways he would never know, how many times the world had been kinder than it appeared. He no longer believed the system was fair, but he believed people could be. That belief was enough. Years later, Liam would forget the details, the machines, the nights, the fear. Memory softened the edges of pain, and Ethan was grateful for that. But something deeper would remain, a quiet understanding shaped by example rather than explanation. That when you see someone in need, you pause. That when you can help, you try. That you don't wait for certainty or reward. You act because you are human. Ethan folded the jacket one last time and placed it in a donation bin, a strange sense of completion settling in his chest. It had served its purpose. So had the night it represented. Life moved forward, as it always did. And somewhere far beyond what Ethan could see, the ripple from one small decision continued outward, touching lives, altering paths, proving that even in a world ruled by chance and limitation, a single moment of compassion could still make all the difference. Some stories don't end with applause or celebration. They end quietly, the way most real lives do, not with certainty, but with understanding. Ethan never became wealthy. He never gained recognition. There was no headline about a single father who stopped in the rain or a foundation worker who chose to look closer. Life simply went on, imperfect and demanding, but no longer ruled by fear. What changed wasn't the world. It was the space Ethan occupied within it. He learned that kindness doesn't rewrite the past or guarantee the future. It doesn't protect you from loss, exhaustion, or impossible choices. What it does is remind you who you are when everything else feels uncertain. On one rainy night, Ethan made a decision without knowing the outcome. He didn't stop because he expected help in return. He stopped because in that moment, helping was the only thing that allowed him to live with himself. And that was enough. Because sometimes the smallest choices, the ones no one sees, the ones that cost you time, comfort, or certainty, are the ones that shape everything that comes after. Not immediately, not dramatically, but faithfully. So the next time you're faced with a moment like that, a hesitation, a crossroads, a stranger who needs more than the world seems willing to give, remember this: you don't have to be powerful. You don't have to be certain. You just have to be willing to stop. If this story reminded you that kindness still matters, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's risky, consider sharing it with someone who might need that reminder today. And if you've ever been helped by a stranger in a moment you'll never forget, we'd love to hear your story in the comments. Because every act of compassion creates a ripple, and you never know how far yours might travel, or who it might bring back to you when you need it most. Sometimes all it takes is stopping in the rain.